Hey everybody, welcome to Primo Nutmeg. For all of you who were disappointed last time that we did not have a guest on the show, well, this time we have a very special treat. We have two guests on the show. With me today are two of the top journalists in the media today, Katie Maté and Matt Taibbi. Katie Maté is the host of Pushback and works with Greyzone. He's also a contributor to The Nation and previously worked with The Real News and Democracy Now! Hey Aaron, how's it going?
How you doing?
Very good. Matt Taibbi is a journalist with Rolling Stone, and he is also the author of Hate Inc. and co-host of Useful Idiots with Katie Halper. Hey, Matt, how's it going?
I'm good. How are you doing?
Very good. Thank you. Appreciate you both being on the show. And just want to thank you both for, being guests on the show previously, really helping give credibility to the show, helping build an audience. And I'm a huge fan of both of your work, so it's really an honor to have you both on.
Oh, excellent. Thank you.
So I did want to start off by talking about UkraineGate, and I think that there's a lot of parallels to RussiaGate. And just starting off, I think that you two have really shown a lot of bravery by being outspoken about what a farce RussiaGate was and what a farce UkraineGate is. And when I look at other media outlets, obviously there's people like Jimmy Dore and Lee Camp and Katie Halper, but they're few and far between. And even progressive news outlets like Democracy Now! And also the Young Turks, I don't think that they've really shown that kind of bravery that you folks have. So I just would maybe want a little bit of insight on, why you folks may think that the Young Turks, Democracy Now!, The Real News, why they may have bought into this corporate media neo-Cold War narrative. And Aaron, I don't know if you maybe want to start that off.
Sure. First, I don't accept actually the characterization that it's brave of us to push back on this, because it's the RussiaGate story especially was so stupid. This idea of a conspiracy between reality TV host Donald Trump and Russia, and this parallel idea that Russian social media trolls are an existential threat to the US. It was so dumb, and the interest behind it was so obvious that it would have been journalistically derelict not to expose that. And as the facts have come out, that stance has obviously been vindicated. In terms of why progressive outlets have gone along with it, I just think basically people have been duped. There has been basically a psyop to enroll liberals and progressives in an agenda that serves the narrow interests of the neoliberal elites who lost to Donald Trump. Because enough voters in enough states rejected the neoliberal legacy that they represent, converging with the interests of the national security state who oppose Trump for their own narrow reasons. They don't see him as a suitable steward of the U.S. global war machine, and they don't like his occasional deviations from bipartisan orthodoxy, including him calling for getting along with Russia. And so that, a lot of propaganda went into convincing liberals and progressives that this was the dominant way to resist Donald Trump. And that instead of going out and protesting him based on his reactionary right-wing agenda, the way to oppose him was to put your faith in Robert Mueller and the national security state. And I think because of a combination of the trauma of Trump's election, people were so shocked by it. That created a space for, people to be taken advantage of. And I think, it became coupled with the demonization of Russia and the demonization of Vladimir Putin and the effectiveness of smear tactics, where if you, ask for evidence about certain, claims like Russia hacked our democracy, or if you question, bipartisan orthodoxy, you can be smeared as a Russian dupe or Russian plant. So all those things, a combination of trauma of Trump's victory and I guess credulity and cowardice, led to progressive outlets going along with this.
So, Matt, I don't know if you have anything to add to that. And, I think another part of it that I have heard some folks bring up is money that, Young Turks may have received in investments. And I believe that Democracy Now! Also gets money from, think tanks like the Ford Foundation, I believe. Do you think that may play a role in this, or do you think that it really just may be progressives trying to resist Trump through any means necessary?
I mean, I think there's probably a couple of cases where that plays a role. I know Mother Jones had some kind of arrangement where they what was that, Aaron? They had some kind of a deal where they got money to investigate the Russia situation, right? Yeah,
Yes, a very rich guy whose last name is Glazer gave them a lot of money for a RussiaGate based project.
right. And then there are things like the Democracy Integrity Project, which they're basically spoon feeding research to a lot of reporters, so that makes it a little easier for some of these narratives to be advanced. But I don't think that's really what it is. I think it's really as simple as journalists are pack animals. They tend to go in the direction that everybody else is going. And this is a story where, from the very beginning, there was almost total unanimity about what the message was going to be. And also, I think people looked at people like Aaron and myself and Glenn Greenwald, and they didn't necessarily want to be the kid with lice in the party, and the two things have a powerful sort of compounding effect where there's a relentless amount of propaganda coming from Democratic Party officials and from unnamed intelligence sources and from other people. And then the converse of it is if you're the person who asks questions about it or sort of denies any aspect of the story, there's all this reprobation you're going to get from your peers. You're not going to get asked on television. Like marketing opportunities are going to dry up for you. And so that's it's a classic propaganda situation. It's similar to what we saw during the run up to the Iraq War. Although I think this is a little different because it's infected the quote unquote liberal and progressive side of the aisle a little bit more, or a lot more, I would say.
And I want to be very clear because I used to work at Democracy Now! I was there for 10 years, so I know Amy Goodman very well. And I've heard the theories that foundation money and donor money influenced her. And I want to say that I really don't buy that at all. I think she has a lot of integrity and is a very noble person. I just think that in this case, there was just a lack of thinking here, and she got bad advice, and it became so fashionable to go along with this narrative, and as Matt talked about, the consequences of challenging it were laid very bare, where you get accused of being a Russian dupe and a Trump apologist and all this stuff, and it creates this dynamic where it becomes more and more difficult. And to Amy's credit, she did have on Glenn Greenwald periodically to debunk all the RussiaGate propaganda.
Also Noam Chomsky.
And Noam Chomsky too. So we have to be fair. Now, Democracy Now! Having grown up on it, having worked there and been a big part of it, it was so disappointing to see them parrot the narrative and interview people like Marcy Wheeler, one of the most prominent RussiaGate conspiracy theorists, as their go-to expert. But I don't think we should say that they had bad motives there or corrupt motives. I just think that this was just an unfortunate dynamic where Trump won and people got co-opted into a really cynical agenda, but not out of corrupt intent on their part, at least in the case of DN. We talk about MSNBC. That's a case where this thing was profitable. This thing was profitable for them. They weren't doing so well in the ratings. Matt has written about this extensively. So there we see a cynical agenda of a ratings motive, and also, they're in lockstep with the Democratic Party leadership. That's just what they do. But when we get to other places, I think we need to be a bit more, it's a bit less cynical than I think we imagine.
So I did also want to get into UkraineGate because this is really going to dominate the news, at least in the short term, I think, with Trump's impeachment. Matt, what would you say the parallels are between UkraineGate and RussiaGate, and how did RussiaGate kind of lay the framework for and maybe even help inspire UkraineGate and Trump's impeachment or potential impeachment?
Well, it's the same people, first of all. I mean, I think that's you got a similar cast of characters. You've got the same, sort of former and current and former intelligence officials, people from all the different intelligence agencies. You've got the ex, Brennan, Clapper, and Comey all speaking out about it. You have Adam Schiff as your front person, and Gerald Nadler. All this is essentially like the last act of RussiaGate that was delayed when the Mueller report didn't come out the way everybody expected it to. I think the expectation within the party was that the Mueller report was going to set lay the foundation for an impeachment movement. And when the report didn't come out the way they wanted to, the first thing they tried was to have Mueller come on and be the movie that would sell it better than the book of the Mueller report, and that failed. And so this is now sort of just the next step. I mean, it's obviously a different set of facts, and I think it's been notable that people don't want to talk about RussiaGate at all. They want us to talk about UkraineGate as if it's a completely new story that doesn't have any sort of background at all, because I think the previous facts of RussiaGate were so adverse and so absurd. But there's lots of superficial similarities in that, the story begins with a conscience-stricken insider within like the intelligence community who has a secret report that has to surface, and it's leaked out in piecemeal and breadcrumb fashion in the media, and then there's followed by an investigation and in public hearings. So there are a lot of superficial similarities, but the main thing is it's the same people, it's the same premise, the same underlying subtext of an offense against the national security establishment, his refusal to go along with the national security consensus, the need to oppose Russian aggression in the Donbass and all of that. So I think there's a lot of similarities there, and psychologically it's very, very similar.
And what I also find interesting is that the issue here is Trump supposedly asking for a quid pro quo to investigate the Biden family's corruption in Ukraine, which is a funny parallel to RussiaGate, because that was also, exposing what was happening in the DNC and
right.
the Hillary Clinton campaign. So it seems like a funny sort of parallel where you're wanting to, blame the people who are trying to expose something as opposed to the underlying corruption. Aaron,
sorry to interrupt before Aaron gets this, because Aaron has already talked about this with the recent British story, where you had that sudden headline in the Telegraph about how the Russians were behind the leaking of the document of the DHS negotiations between the United States and the UK. It's exactly the same thing. It's a revelation about some kind of insider corruption within the kind of neoliberal political establishment. We're suddenly shifting focus to make it a story about Russian interference, and we're simultaneously placing that corruption, linking it to some kind of outsider figure, political figure who has to bear the burden of that. I mean, I think you've talked about that, right?
Well,
yeah.
it's exactly the same thing. So you have the talks exposed between the U.S. and the Tory British government about basically privatizing the NHS, the National Health Service in Britain. That gets exposed. Jeremy Corbyn, the Labour opposition leader, publicizes it. Shortly afterwards, you have all of a sudden claims that all this is the work of a Russian intelligence operation. No one's questioning the authenticity of the leaked documents. But they're saying that it was stolen and released by Russia. The source for this claim is none other than the Atlantic Council. The Telegraph story that released this called them independent researchers, but then later on identifies them as being from the Atlantic Council. And who's the Atlantic Council? The Atlantic Council is a major Washington think tank funded by major donors, including the U.S. and British governments. So these are your independent researchers. And now Corbyn and everyone's going along with it. Is Corbyn helping to spread Russian propaganda? It's the exact same thing, and it's the playbook. It's why RussiaGate was not just about, it was not just about, an effort by the national security state and failed neoliberals to challenge Trump in the limited way that they could. It was also a way to discredit the left, because Bernie Sanders almost won in 2016, and he might have taken the nomination if not for the Democratic Party corruption that the stolen Democratic Party emails exposed. And his rise was a major threat to the neoliberal establishment. And instead of embracing the trend that he brought forward and embracing the mass movement that he worked to build, they needed something else. And so they needed fear mongering and tainting their opponents as being backed by a foreign power as one of the few options that they had left. So now they're repackaging that, using that against Jeremy Corbyn as he appears, as he threatens to win victory in Britain. So it's a convergence of cynical interests in this way, is not just against Trump, but also against progressives. And let me say about UkraineGate, where it comes from. I think we have to look at it in the context of the geopolitical reality since the fall of the Soviet Union, where basically since then, in contrary to what the U.S. promised the Soviet Union, which is that the U.S. would not expand NATO to the east, the U.S. has done the exact opposite. It's been expanding NATO pretty much right up to Ukraine, to Russia's borders. And the coup in Ukraine in 2014 was the latest step in that, and the latest effort to basically bring Ukraine into Russia's orbit. That set off this proxy war that is now ongoing in Ukraine between the U.S. and Russia. And Trump briefly freezing this military aid, which is what it's called, but really it's money to buy U.S. weapons, was a potential threat to that. And so I think that's why you saw this outrage in the national security state. And again, when you have Democrats who don't have really anything to offer voters because they don't want to threaten the system that they benefit from, then going along with the national security state and their opposition to Trump is really one of the few options they have. And that's what I think helps explain why we have, once again, UkraineGate, like RussiaGate, consuming the country.
Now, I don't know if either of you can kind of help elucidate this for me, because one thing that I find pretty funny about this is that Joe Biden, I believe, went on record at a Council on Foreign Relations event saying that he was withholding money from Ukraine when he was vice president until a prosecutor got fired.
I'll give you one concrete example. I was, not but it just happened to be that was the assignment I got. I got all the good ones. So I got Ukraine. And I remember going over convincing our team, or others too, convincing us that we should be providing for loan guarantees. And I went over, I guess, the 12th, 13th time to Kyiv, and I was supposed to announce that there was another $1 billion loan guarantee. And I had gotten a commitment from Poroshenko and from Yatsenyuk that they would take action against the state prosecutor, and they didn't. So they said they were walking out to press conference. I said, no, I'm not going to, or we're not going to give you the $1 billion. They said, you have no authority. You're not the president. The president said. I said, call him. I said, I'm telling you, you're not getting the $1 billion. I said, you're not getting the $1 billion. I'm going to be leaving here. And I think it was, 6 hours? I said, I'm leaving in 6 hours. If the prosecutor's not fired, you're not getting the money. Well, son of a bitch. Got fired.
Wouldn't that be him admitting to what Trump is being accused of?
Well, yeah, I think the Democratic argument would be that the circumstances are different. They would claim that the prosecutor Sergei Shokin was actually Victor Shokin, I'm sorry, was actually corrupt, and they're not claiming that it was for personal benefit. Because they're I spoke to the Biden campaign about this. So they obviously their position is that they wanted Shokin out because he wasn't being aggressive enough in prosecuting corruption. Now the actual facts of this are a little bit odd, but that's what their position would be, and that's why they would say that it's not the same thing.
And I think it's actually a fair argument. It is true that Trump. I think it was inappropriate of Trump to bring up Joe Biden with Zelensky in that phone call and to ask for an investigation that would implicate a domestic political rival. I think Democrats actually have an argument there. I don't think it's worthy of impeachment, though, and I don't think they've proven their case at all that Trump leveraged military funding to achieve that investigation. Their best witness was Gordon Sondland, who was the only Trump official who actually spoke to Trump and who actually communicated some kind of linkage between the military assistance and an investigation to the Ukrainian side. Well, what did he say in his testimony? He said that Trump and him actually never talked about the military assistance, and that linkage was only his presumption. But he had no evidence to base it on. It was only his presumption, which is just as valuable for the purposes of making a case as, say, Kurt Volker, the U.S. envoy to Ukraine, who did not have that presumption. So, you can't make a case based on someone's presumption. You need evidence for it, which is why I think Democrats had grounds to put forward a censure vote in Congress, saying that it was inappropriate for Trump to ask Ukraine to investigate Biden and to bring up Biden in that phone call. But to make this an impeachment thing, which, for all the consequences of that, including overshadowing the Democratic Party, and then going to a Senate trial where Republicans are going to take the occasion to highlight what is very obvious about Biden's corruption. I mean, put aside what Biden did and trying to fire that prosecutor. It's just a fact that Biden's son, after Biden's administration staged, or helped back a coup in Ukraine, that Biden's son, Hunter, his unqualified kid, got a lucrative energy board seat. And that's just straight up corrupt. And Biden was the point man for the U.S. on supposedly ending corruption in Ukraine. And his kid is getting a board seat in Ukraine, a board seat that he's totally unqualified for. And he's getting paid, I don't know, it was well over $2 million, I think $3 million or something. So, and the Senate trial is going to bring attention to that. The Republicans are going to use this to highlight Biden's corruption, and ultimately will vote for his acquittal. So that's why I just thought that tactically this was a massive blunder.
Also, just to quickly, there are some things about the circumstances of when Biden made that request that are still kind of unclear. Like one of the storylines that came out when this story broke was that at the time that Biden made the request to the Ukrainian government that Shokin be removed, that all investigations of the company Burisma were dormant. You'll see that word used over and over again in news stories. But I'm not sure that that's actually the case. There are a couple of things that suggest that there were a couple of investigations at least going on at the time. A former colleague of mine, Yulia Latinina of Novaya Gazeta, which is the big opposition paper in Russia, she did an expose which showed that there was an investigation of a guy named Sergei Korchenko, who was a Russian who was taking monies that were stolen by the Russian opposition movement in the Donbass, stolen from Ukrainian companies, and then funneling it to Burisma, and including to Rosemont Seneca, which is Hunter Biden's company. So that investigation is ongoing. They showed documents from that case. And then also there was an investigation of Mykola Zlochevsky. His property was actually seized after Biden's visit to Ukraine to get to where he made that demand. So there were at least a couple of things going on. Now, whether or not that had anything to do with investigating Burisma in connection with Hunter Biden is not clear. Probably not, maybe not. But I don't think it's factually true to say that they were all dormant.
So another thing I want to ask about is the role of Ukraine in the 2016 election, because this is something I believe was recently brought up in the news, was saying that Russia is now backing this narrative that Ukraine was influencing the 2016 election or was trying to play some role. So I guess repeating that is effectively repeating a Russian talking point. But I don't know if either of you can just give a bit of insight into what that underlying claim is that Ukraine may have done something during the 2016 election.
I can say quickly that, so what do we accuse Russia of? We accuse Russia of attacking the country, of committing a Pearl Harbor 9/11 like cyber attack. That's an analog we'll often hear on MSNBC, and for stealing emails that expose corruption inside the Democratic Party. Okay? That's what Russia's accused of doing. Well, what did Ukraine do? Ukrainian officials leaked information about Paul Manafort that exposed corruption by Paul Manafort, and it actually was consequential. It led to his resignation. Basically, they leaked what was called the Black Ledger, showing secret payments by the party of the then Ukrainian president Yanukovych to Manafort. Now, those payments might not even be real. The evidence amounts to some handwritten notes, and so it's not even convincing. Not that Paul Manafort wasn't corrupt in Ukraine. He totally was. But Manafort has disputed the authenticity of these documents, and actually I've not seen even independent confirmation of them. But regardless, whether they're real or not, the point is the leaking of the Black Ledger was done to weaken the Trump campaign, as Ukrainian officials openly discussed at the time. It was in the Financial Times in August 2016, and it was consequential. It led to Manafort's resignation. So it's not exactly what Russia is accused of doing, but there are a lot of similarities. But yet there's this effort to deny that ever happened and to dismiss it as a conspiracy theory when it's documented. Also documented is the fact that a DNC contractor, Alexander Chalupa, met with Ukrainian embassy officials in a bid to dig up dirt on Paul Manafort. And we don't know the full story there and to what extent that led to the leaking of the Black Ledger that implicated Manafort, but it was all happening.
And I think what's interesting about this is that if you watch the way this is covered, there's a lot of noise around the semantics of, what are we calling help, what are we calling interference, and what are we calling meddling. It's just exposing corruption when it's Ukraine releasing information about Paul Manafort. But as Aaron points out, that's kind of exactly the narrative of RussiaGate. The difference being, I guess you could say that the DNC letters were hacked. There was a court case about this as well in Ukraine. How legitimate that was. I think it was subsequently overturned. Is that right, Aaron?
It was overturned. Yeah.
Yeah. So, but to say that there's nothing at all on that to that story, to the idea that Ukraine somehow was involved in the 2016 election or interfered. I mean, it's just a semantic question, no matter how you want to look at it. Do you want to call it interference? Do you want to call it meddling? Do you want to call it help? Whatever it is, they had some kind of an impact on the election, or at least they tried to. And so it's I think there's a lot of arguments just around the wording here.
So going to the impeachment overall, it seems to me, and I think to a lot of observers who aren't really even paying attention to the impeachment proceedings, because we all kind of, seemingly know the outcome. It's that, Trump could get impeached by the House, but he's not going to be removed from office. And this probably is going to really energize his base and give him a lot of fodder moving into the 2020 election. So, I mean, would you both agree with that? Do you think that, Trump could potentially get removed from office, or do you think that this may even just hurt him going into the 2020 election?
I don't think I think there's already significant evidence that this is not going to hurt him really on any level. There's not any evidence of any Republicans that are going to budge. So I think it's an extreme long shot to suggest that this will end in his actual removal. The numbers already show that his approval rating is back to where it was before this story broke. It's at 44%. It's ticked up, since the first televised hearings. The support for impeachment has declined in the key battleground states. So I don't think you can really argue that this is going to help the Democratic Party electorally. And this is something I think we all speculated about before this happened, and before they tried before there was impeachment consideration about RussiaGate as well. That if they went ahead and did this, the idea that they're going to have nonstop round-the-clock coverage about a process that's going to end with a victory by Trump, with Adam Schiff front and center on a daily basis, that it's just not going to help the Democrats in an election year. I don't really fully understand what they're doing. I think it's a little bit of a mystery whether they actually think it's going to work or not. It's kind of interesting, actually.
If you look at the polls, it's basically the popular vote from 2016. It's basically the popular vote from 2016 has not budged. And for the purposes of defeating Trump, the popular vote does not matter because, of course, Trump lost the popular vote in 2016. What matters is, as Matt talked about, it's the battleground states. And there, the polls show that impeachment is not winning. And for obvious reasons. I mean, Glenn Greenwald had a tweet recently where he pointed out that Trump is going to be looking at these, job numbers that just came out. He had a good jobs report, unemployment at a record low. And whether those numbers are legitimate or not, and whether Trump deserves any credit, he doesn't. But whether, putting that aside, that is what he's going to weaponize, and he's going to exploit that. And that's going to be his message. Job numbers are good, and economy is going along well. And what is the top message associated with Democrats? It's RussiaGate and UkraineGate, and it's this hysterical, jingoistic, unhinged language that that we heard at the impeachment hearings recently, where you had one of the top Democratic experts testifying that we're helping Ukraine fight Russia there, so we don't have to fight them here. I mean, who's going to believe that, especially and care about that in the states that matters? I mean, it's like Democrats are presenting people with, as we talked about, nothing. And I think for a very obvious reason. Is it's their resistance to being an actual opposition party and challenging the system that gave us Trump, because they benefit from that system. They have power within it. So instead, they want to try to make Trump the problem. And in that respect, they have very narrow options. And so they have to present him as some sort of unique threat who is possibly compromised by Russia and go along with this fiction, because that's all they have. And I think, Matt was on the campaign trail. And I think, I'd love to actually hear, Matt, about, whether, based on what you saw when you were going around the country in 2016, what you heard from people and whether you see the Democratic Party in its leadership, speaking to any of those people who you saw vote for Trump out of sort of as a protest vote against the establishment.
No, I mean, I think they're making exactly this. They're repeating exactly the same mistake from 2016. They're ceding the entire populist argument to Donald Trump. Trump talked about a variety of things, whether it was the outsized influence of corporate donors on the political process, whether it was exports of manufacturing jobs, the people being tired of funding NATO and the other member countries not paying their dues, the effects of our Middle East wars and how they're a bad deal, all those things. And he talked about inequality and political elites and Goldman Sachs, and here we are heading into another election. And we talked about this last week on Useful Idiots. Goldman Sachs is sponsoring forums for the Democratic presidential candidates, and 6 of them have already accepted. The ones you would expect have not accepted, right? It's Bernie and Warren. But as Aaron pointed out, the Democratic Party is in a very, very difficult position because they can't really go too far in the populist direction without endorsing all the policies that they don't want to succeed, that Bernie and to a lesser extent Elizabeth Warren are endorsing. So they have to find an argument against Trump and Trumpism that is about something else. And this is the best they've got. I mean, you have Nancy Pelosi saying all roads lead to Putin. I mean, what America got a mailbox stuffed with bills thinks all roads lead to Putin? They got so many other things to worry about. But this is the only thing they can go with. And I think that's what people have to understand, is that it's not just a dumb idea. This is their only option, I think. And I think that's why they're doing this.
So I did want to get to some questions from my patrons. Primo Nutmeg patrons can submit questions to guests. So I just wanted to give you guys a couple. This one's from Jackie McCaffrey. Jackie writes, I would like to hear them compare and contrast Bernie and Tulsi's foreign policy positions. First, in a pure way, these are the differences in how they might play out in real-time presidency. And secondly, politically in terms of the horse race. That's to either of you.
Aaron, you want to take that? I mean, having interviewed both of them, obviously, I think it's interesting. Bernie doesn't like to talk about foreign policy as much as Tulsi does. I think that's the first thing that you would notice about them, is that it's, Tulsi Gabbard spends a lot of time talking about regime change wars. She's a veteran, and her experience leads her to kind of an interesting position. Like, she's not what you would call classically anti-war. She does believe in military action against against Al Qaeda, against Al Nusra, but she doesn't believe in the brand of military action that we've endorsed, in particular lately, which is this idea of invasion, changing government, and then occupying the government, and this so-called democracy promotion. Right? It's this whole starter kit of foreign policies. She's very specifically against that, and that's kind of an evangelical belief for her. Bernie, I think he's sort of more of a classical liberal. He's just he's more in the Chomsky vein of being. It's a very similar position. I just don't think it's as much of an emphasis for Bernie somehow. He's been very brave lately in talking about the protests in South America and opposing U.S. influence there. He was less aggressive about that earlier in the year, and so I think he's moved more in that direction lately.
Yeah, if you look at Bernie's life, I mean, he's has a history of promoting solidarity with victims of U.S. imperialism. In the 1980s, he traveled to Nicaragua and tried to establish a sister city between Vermont and Managua, I believe, to oppose the Reagan administration's Contra War in Nicaragua. And, he voted against the Iraq War. I mean, I know he's had some bad votes here and there. But look, when you compare his stance with Tulsi Gabbard on Israel-Palestine, I think he's been more vocally critical of the Israeli government and talked about even conditioning U.S. military aid to Israel in ways that I haven't heard Tulsi say. But meanwhile, Tulsi Gabbard's been incredibly brave on Syria, opposing the proxy war there, and even trying to pass a resolution on it to end, the U.S. support for quote unquote rebels in Syria, who ended up being Al Qaeda, basically. So, and she's taken a lot of heat for that, and has been falsely smeared as an Assad apologist and all this stuff. So,
as have we all.
As have we all, yeah. So, but I know there's a strain of Tulsi supporters who believe that she's way better than Bernie on foreign policy, and I just don't like pitting them against each other, because I think both have really strong points and both have flaws. And I think the fact that we have two candidates who, in their own ways, are willing to, deviate from the bipartisan foreign policy consensus is great, and we should welcome both their voices in the race.
So now to a joke question. Greg would like to know if Matt's debate drinking game can be played with weed instead of booze.
I wholeheartedly endorse that, especially as I get older. It's getting more and more painful each debate. So, I think I'm going to have to start moving in that direction. We're actually thinking about having a couple of variations of the game that involve some non-alcoholic substitutes with useful idiots. So we'll see going forward.
One other question. How was the pushback against red baiting? How has it changed since the Mueller report came out on social media? Did it change people's minds at all? So it's to either of you.
I don't know. It's hard to say. I do think there's more space for us than there was throughout the 3 years of starting with in the summer of 2016, and then when Mueller took over in May 2017 up until Mueller's report finally. I do think there's more space for us now. I do hear from more people on an individual level saying, that their minds have changed, and they totally were devoted Maddow watchers at the start. Now they're not anymore. But it's hard to quantify that on a mass scale. And I do think in terms of, will I ever be invited on CNN and MSNBC? Will Matt ever be invited back on MSNBC? I think Matt was last on there in like January 2017.
Yeah, that was the last time any of us were, I think, really, right? I mean, it was.
Or Bill Maher's show. I mean, you used to be on Bill Maher's show all the time.
Yeah, and who knows what that's about? But I mean, I think it's been very, very conspicuous that nobody who had really much of a contra take on RussiaGate has really been on any of the cable networks, recently. However, I think, as Aaron points out, it's now become okay to say that the network screwed up RussiaGate and that there were excesses. And I think especially from media critics and media reporters, it's now okay to say that there were excesses and that there were enormous amounts of errors that took place back then. But the mania has basically just shifted onto impeachment, and it's to me, it has exactly the same psychological tenor as the early days of RussiaGate. It's the same idea of you must be on board, and even if you're just not saying anything at all, that's already suspect. You'll get trolls on social media and emails from people saying, "How come you're not saying, co-signing this or that?" And that's, it does have a powerful effect on people. I think and it's achieving the same thing. I think. I don't know if you agree, Aaron, but people are just they're kind of falling in lockstep with it, just among other things, out of exhaustion and just not wanting to deal with it. That to me feels very similar.
Well, yeah, going back to what you said earlier about all the things that Trump was saying on the campaign trail in 2016, about opposing militarism, opposing Wall Street, dealing with helping the working class, restoring factories, all these things that Trump has not done. So it would be so easy for Democrats to run on that agenda and to highlight that and say, look at this con man. Look at how he's not giving you anything, and look what we're going to do to actually bring those things, to actually, help the working class, bring back good paying jobs, bring back factories. There's none of that from the Democratic leadership. Again, basically it's another con. It's this. First, it was the con that he was a Russian agent. Now it's this con that he's endangering U.S. national security because he briefly froze some military aid and he's threatening the sanctity of our beautiful elections. And, but for some reason, when we point that out, it's still painted as being pro-Trump, when all, at least I'm saying, is that why don't you oppose Trump for the harm he's doing to this country and not trying to basically double down on another national security state fueled fixation that is also totally hyperbolic and overblown. And for people who have been heavily propagandized, it's hard to distinguish between, what could be that just because we're opposing something like this doesn't mean we're pro-Trump. I'm actually tired of giving Trump gifts like Russiagate was, but it's hard for people to see that because they've been conditioned and told repeatedly that this is going to bring down Trump. And if you don't go along with it, then somehow you're supporting Trump too.
And that's one of the reasons why I've been so frustrated both with Russiagate and now with the impeachment thing, is that it in addition to whatever the ostensible goal was with Russiagate and now impeachment, I think the primary goal is that it's just a battering ram to go after any kind of dissent. It's a way of controlling the narrative and controlling the discourse and policing the sort of public airwaves. We've sort of decreed that this is what the opinion is going to be, and people become afraid to deviate from it one way or the other. And you've seen it. You saw Russiagate used against everybody from Tulsi Gabbard to Bernie Sanders to to Jill Stein to Trump and to Mitch McConnell. I mean, it's just a way of branding people who fall outside a certain parameter of being somehow the other, right? And that's what I think is so dangerous about both these movements, is that they're using it to basically control. It's like an Orwellian thought control exercise, and that's what's so bothersome.
So I know that we're running over. I just want to give you guys one last question from one of my patrons. He says, do you think progressive journalists and commentators would eventually have to move away from Silicon Valley's manipulation surveillance platforms like Facebook, Twitter, and YouTube? And how much time do you guys spend on those platforms, and do you think that it's worth it?
I mean, I've written about this. I wrote a couple of stories about this when they started having discussions with, again, in conjunction with Russiagate, when the Senate invited Facebook, Twitter, and Google to the Hill and sort of asked them to come up with strategies for preventing the quote unquote sowing of discord. They started partnering up the platforms with groups like the Atlantic Council, who Aaron mentioned before, to combat quote unquote fake news and foreign interference. And I thought that was really dangerous from the outset, because these platforms, just a couple of them, control a significant percentage of the news traffic in this country. And if you are able to get some kind of a lever over that discourse, then that's very, very dangerous. So yeah, in the future, I think it's going to become incumbent upon people to start using different platforms to stay away from that. But I don't know how effective that's going to be. I mean, I'm just worried generally about the ability of these companies, in conjunction with a couple of interested insiders and maybe the consultation of law enforcement, the way it works in countries like China or Israel even. That's a future scenario that I don't particularly want to see happen.
Yeah, it's very scary, and I don't know what the answer is. I mean, I certainly do use all these platforms, and I spend a lot of time, especially on Twitter, more time than I should. And we at my show Pushback, I just interviewed my colleague Max Blumenthal about the White Helmets, this group in Syria that is known around the world for rescuing civilians, that and has rescued civilians, but also has been used as a PR tool to manufacture support for the proxy war in Syria, and also has really documented ties to jihadist groups, including Al Qaeda, and is taking part in executions. And we talked about that, and we showed some video, and that got immediately restricted. We even re-edited the video to take out some graphic footage in the hope so it wouldn't get restricted, but we re-uploaded it, and it still got restricted anyway. So there wasn't even any graphic footage in the re-uploaded video, but just the message was deemed to be inappropriate by YouTube, and so they restricted, how people can share it and who could watch it. So it's scary, and I don't know the alternative, and I'm sure that those alternatives will develop more, and I'm certainly open to them. But in the meantime, I'm not going to shun all this stuff. It's just you got to play in the game that you're in, and I'm not totally panicking on this front yet, but certainly it's worrisome.
And just about that, what's going to happen is people will see that. All right, they're going to see what happens when you try to upload X content, and they're just going to self-censor. They're not going to put something up because why bother, right? Why poke the bear? Why risk getting thrown off the medium? And that will accelerate, sort of homogenization of speech really, really quickly. That's that's the worrisome part for me too.
Well, apologies to the patrons whose questions I didn't get to. Had a lot of questions for both of you. There was obviously a lot of interest. A lot of people look up to both of you as voices of reason and an insane media. Just a quick question for both of you. Who are journalists that you guys look up to?
I grew up, Cy Hirsch was somebody I really looked up to always. He was always sort of my image of like a reporter, what they should be, because they're kind of constantly in trouble with their bosses for trying to put things on that nobody wants to hear. I think that's and he's kind of stayed that way. So he's a hero of mine. He's still at it.
Yeah, Cy is a legend. He's also hilarious.
Yeah, he is really funny.
He's so funny, and he does, he just doesn't care. He really, it's so easy to be brittle and sensitive, and I had to go through this of getting called names, and you see people who, it's not nice not to be liked. I mean, everybody wants to be liked, and you have to get to a point though where you just don't care anymore, where actually what matters above all are the facts and the trade and the craft that you're in. And Cy has got to that point a long time ago, and so from the work he's done and also his attitude towards it, where all he cares about is getting at the truth. He doesn't care if people call him, as they have, an Assad apologist, because he's done such important work exposing some of the lies in the Syria proxy war. He doesn't care. And so he's a model for me in many respects, including his very healthy attitude towards the whole thing.
Well, again, I definitely look up to both of you. I think that you both do amazing work, and a lot of people like me look up to both of you as well. So please keep producing the wonderful content that you both are. Aaron, I don't know if maybe you have any upcoming articles that you'd like to talk about, or episodes of Pushback.
Well, we are all over this. We're all over UkraineGate. We're all over the OPCW scandal, where it's the most stunning thing, and it should be, I think, the biggest story in the world, where you have two whistleblowers at the world's top chemical weapons watchdog, at least two, actually, I should say. I think there's maybe even more, releasing documents, releasing testimony that basically accuses the OPCW of fraud in suppressing evidence to lend credibility to the airstrikes led by the U.S. along with Britain and France on Syria in April 2018 over accusations of a chemical weapons attack against the Syrian government in Douma. The evidence that was suppressed, they say, basically points to the fact that it was not the Syrian government, but that the attack was basically staged to manufacture support for the U.S.-led airstrikes that ensued. And there's been a total silence on this issue from the corporate media. Anybody who discusses it as being attacked as an Assad apologist, and there's more on this coming out, and I'm all over the story because to me it's one of the most important stories in the world. It is so sad that the only mainstream corporate coverage of this has come from Tucker Carlson. Not even Democracy Now! Has covered it. It's that insane, even though among the whistleblowers' allegations is that 3 U.S. officials from the Trump administration were involved in pressuring the OPCW and basically telling the OPCW to tell their scientists to shut up, and that this was basically that this attack was carried out by Assad. So we're all over that, and also definitely going to be covering the Corbyn story we talked about, where Corbyn releasing information showing an attempted privatization of the British Health Service by the U.S. That's being now, just being dismissed as a Russian propaganda operation. So I'll be all over that at The Nation and at Pushback as well.
Awesome. Those are very important stories, so thank you for your work on those. Matt, do you have any upcoming either articles in Rolling Stone or guests on Useful Idiots that you'd like to talk about?
Well, we got Glenn Greenwald coming up on Useful Idiots this week, so it should be fun. A couple other fun ones. We just had Andrew Yang. That's out there now. Starting in the new year, I'm going to be covering the election pretty regularly, so I'm going to go back out in the campaign trail. So we're going to do some remote stuff involving that. So yeah, and it should be fun.
Let me say, Useful Idiots, as of late, Matt's show with Katie Halper has been coming under some attacks on social media by supporters and whitewashers of the Syria proxy war because they committed the crime of interviewing Max Blumenthal. None of these people challenge a single fact that Max states, but they just hate the fact that Max is interviewed because Max very effectively challenges their whole narrative. So if you see people attacking Useful Idiots, please speak up for that show. It's really important. It's actually vital. It's highlighting voices in a mainstream adjacent space that nobody else is doing. So it's very important that we protect Useful Idiots from the disingenuous attacks from real Useful Idiots out there who want to manufacture support for the Syria proxy war and RussiaGate and UkraineGate and whatever else it is that they're aligned with. So.
I agree. I love Useful Idiots. It's a wonderful show. You guys have some awesome guests. By the way, if you could tell Glenn he should be on my show, I'd appreciate it.
Right,
He's actually retweeted. He's retweeted me a few times, but he won't respond to my emails. But Matt, are you going to be doing any book tours for Hate Inc.?
I did a few things. It's tough because with my schedule now, it's pretty tough to go on the road and with the kids and everything. But I'm gonna have a few more appearances, but I don't think I have anything in Connecticut. So, but we'll see. Well, it's gonna be a little while. I have another book coming out in the fall, so in March. So, but that's a different kind of book. So it's fiction actually.
Oh, awesome! That's cool. Yeah. Well, in any case, hopefully I can meet up with you on the campaign trail at some point.
Absolutely.
I'm hoping to be up in New Hampshire, so let me know when you're up there. And
guys,
again, yeah, definitely. Thank you again, both of you, for being on the show. I really do appreciate it. Again, I really appreciate what you've done for the show by being guests and help growing the audience for this program. Also, thank you for all of the great journalism that you're doing, and I appreciate it. And hopefully I can have you both on at some point in the future.
Absolutely. Thanks so much. Take care. Take care, Aaron. Yep.
Take care. Thanks for having me.
Thanks.
Everybody spends most of their life living in a totalitarian system. It's called having a job.
Challenging a foreign policy establishment and the military-industrial complex.
This is what happens when you start to really threaten the system.